From Sultanate to State, Sokoto's journey of transformation. How can a city breathe history and yet ache for the future? That question echoed through the mind of an elderly storyteller as he sat beneath a baobab tree in the heart of Sokoto. His voice was calm, almost whispering, yet it held the weight of centuries. Around him, young children listened, not just to pass the time, but to understand their roots. The soil beneath their feet had once cradled an empire. The wind that swept across the plains had once carried the chants of warriors and scholars alike. Sokoto was not just a city. It was a pulse, a legacy, a longing.
This is the story of Sokoto.
Not as a place, but as a journey. A journey from caliphate to constitution, from saddle to satellite.
From the echo of empires to the cries of modernity.
The birth of a sultanate. Before the flags, before the laws, before the borders, there was the dream of Uthman dan Fodio. In the early 1800s, northern Nigeria was a mosaic of Hausa kingdoms, each with its rulers, rituals, and rivalries. But Uthman dan Fodio, a Fulani Islamic scholar, saw something else, a fractured society in spiritual and moral decay. He was not a warrior by birth, but his words carried the power of thunder. Justice is not a sword, he once said. It is the light that shows the sword when to be raised and when to be sheathed. And so began the jihad of reform, not driven by conquest, but by conviction. Town by town, emirate by emirate, his call spread. In 1804, he declared the Sokoto Caliphate, establishing a theocratic empire grounded in Islamic law, learning, and leadership. At its height, the Caliphate stretched across present-day northern Nigeria, Niger, and Cameroon. It was a beacon of governance, trade, and knowledge. Cities like Kano, Katsina, and Sokoto thrived under its order. Arabic literacy flourished. Markets buzzed.
Justice systems evolved.
Slavery, while present, began to be questioned under Islamic jurisprudence. But every empire sows the seed of its own transformation.
The cracks beneath the turban.
As the 19th century unfolded, the Caliphate grew prosperous, but also rigid. Succession struggles, economic strain, and increasing regional discontent began to fester beneath the surface. And then came the Europeans. The British, masked in the guise of trade and diplomacy, saw opportunity. By the early 1900s, they had perfected a strategy: indirect rule. Let the emirs keep their robes, but replace the throne beneath them. In 1903, after a series of swift campaigns, British forces captured Sokoto. The Caliphate, mighty and mystic, fell not with an explosion, but a negotiation. Sultan Muhammadu Attahairu I died resisting, but the institution was preserved under British oversight. It was no longer a sovereign caliphate. It had become a symbol, a sultanate under colonial command. Between scrolls and skylines, colonial rule introduced railways, schools, administrative districts, but also hierarchy, segregation, and economic exploitation. Sokoto, once the axis of an empire, became a district center in a foreign blueprint. But the spirit of learning persisted. Quranic schools continued. Scholars still debated law, ethics, and purpose. The youth began learning English beside Arabic. The old city walls heard both the call to prayer and the clang of typewriters. In 1960, independence arrived. Nigeria stood as a nation, free but fractured. Sokoto, still led ceremonially by a sultan, had to find its new role. Was it a relic?
A museum of men in turbans?
Or could it become something more?
The state emerges.
In 1976, the Nigerian government carved out Sokoto State as a political entity. No longer just a spiritual seat, Sokoto was now tasked with governance, infrastructure, healthcare, and education. The transition was slow. Roads were dusty. Schools underfunded.
Corruption crept in.
But something remarkable happened. A new generation of leaders rose, sons of clerics, daughters of farmers, ready to serve not just the sultan, but the citizen. Hospitals began to open. Female education, once limited, expanded. Markets grew beyond traditional trade to embrace modern enterprise. Sokoto State was no longer just a reflection of history. It was becoming a participant in Nigeria's future. The echoes of faith and politics. Religion remained central. The Sultan of Sokoto, though without executive power, became the voice of the Muslim Ummah in Nigeria. His words calmed tensions, resolved disputes, and shaped discourse. But faith also brought friction.
Extremism brewed in pockets.
Political manipulation of religion became a dangerous game. The people of Sokoto had to walk a tightrope, preserving identity without becoming prisoners of ideology. Yet in schools and radio stations, in markets and mosques, the conversation continued, how can Sokoto lead again, not by sword, but by sense?
The youth and the yearning.
Today, over 60% of Sokoto's population is under 30. They scroll through TikTok with one hand and hold prayer beads in the other. They crave Wi-Fi and wisdom.
Jobs and justice. Purpose and peace.
Amina, a 19-year-old engineering student, says, I love my heritage, but I also want to code, build, invent. Why can't I do both? And that is Sokoto's question. It is not whether it can honor its past, but whether it can reimagine it.
A fusion of faith and future.
Of scrolls and science. Of turban and tablet.
The road ahead.
From the echoing sermons of Uthman Dan Fodio to the buzzing streets of modern Sokoto, the journey has been anything but simple. It is a saga of resistance and reinvention, of loss and leadership. But perhaps the most powerful truth is this. Sokoto has never stopped transforming. Even now, as its youth rise, as its elders reflect, as its skyline shifts, it continues. Not as a perfect state, but as a pulsing story, still being written, still being lived.
Under the same sky where empires once rose, dreams still rise.
And in every whispered prayer, every classroom, every market stall and policy room, one question remains. How can a city breathe history and still ache for the future? The answer is Sokoto. And the answer is still unfolding. Join the journey with Curiousphere. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep within about heritage, history, and the human spirit, don't let the journey end here. Subscribe to Curiousphere for more powerful narratives, untold truths, and transformational journeys from across the world. Comment your thoughts. What does Sokoto's story mean to you? Share this blog to keep the conversation going and shine a light on stories that matter. Follow us on social media for behind-the-scenes content, community discussions, and upcoming topics that dig deeper than headlines. Curiousphere is where curiosity meets courage, and your voice is part of that revolution. Let's keep asking the hard questions. Let's keep learning.
Let's keep transforming together.